The rain poured relentlessly, forming puddles along the streets of the small town where Daniel had grown up. The sound of raindrops felt muted, as if the weight of the day had dulled even the most familiar noises. He was there to say goodbye to his father, a man who had felt distant in life but now seemed closer than ever. The old cemetery, with its weathered gravestones and ancient trees, was cloaked in an uneasy silence. The few mourners present kept their heads bowed as the pastor led the ceremony. Daniel stood slightly apart, wrestling with the tightness in his chest and fragmented memories that surfaced unbidden. After the burial, he returned to the family home, a place frozen in time. Old books, dusty photographs, and creaking furniture filled the space, each item untouched as if awaiting its owner's return. His mother, a frail woman with soft gestures, suggested he go through his father's belongings to decide what to keep. Daniel agreed out of duty more than desire. He had never been particularly close to his father, but the weight of responsibility urged him forward. In the study, while sorting through stacks of papers, he discovered a dark wooden box tucked beneath a pile. Opening it, he found a photo album he didn't recognize. Its pages were yellowed, and the pictures were secured with corner mounts that looked as old as the house itself. Slowly flipping through, Daniel found photos of his childhood, birthdays, Christmas gatherings, and ordinary moments like picnics in the park. Each picture seemed to capture a happiness he barely remembered. Then, something caught his eye. In the background of one photo stood an unfamiliar man. He wore a dark suit and a hat, his face set in a neutral, almost somber expression. Daniel frowned but continued turning the pages. The same man appeared in other photos, always in the background, always positioned in a similar way. It was as though he was part of the scene, yet entirely separate from it. Puzzled, Daniel carried the album to the living room and showed it to his mother. She adjusted her glasses and examined the photos carefully, but her expression was one of genuine confusion. "I don't know who this is," she said, handing the album back. Daniel pressed her for answers, but she seemed genuinely unaware of the stranger's presence. The unease began to settle in his mind. The man's recurring presence in the photos was impossible to ignore. He hadn't aged, his clothes were always the same, and his posture remained unnervingly consistent, giving the impression of belonging without truly being there. That night, as the house fell into an unsettling silence, Daniel reopened the album. His eyes scanned each image with growing intensity, searching for some clue to explain who the man was. His hands trembled slightly as he turned the pages, but when he reached the final photo, his breath caught. It was a recent picture, taken at his father's last birthday just months before his death. And there was the same man, standing in the background, staring directly into the camera. The discovery ignited a strange determination within Daniel. He knew he had to dig deeper, to find out why this man appeared in such personal and intimate moments of his life. But alongside the growing curiosity was a disquiet he couldn't shake. As he closed the album and placed it back in the box, the house seemed to shift. The shadows in the corners of the room felt heavier, and the once soothing sound of the rain against the windows now carried an eerie, whisper-like quality. Daniel resolved to begin his search for answers the next day. The next morning, Daniel woke up with his mind still fixated on the images from the album. The house was quiet, except for the occasional creak of the wooden floors. His mother had left early to deal with matters related to the will, leaving Daniel alone with his thoughts and a stack of disjointed memories. He grabbed the album again, as though the daylight might offer clarity to the enigma of the man in the photos. Determined to find answers, Daniel drove into town to consult a local photographer, Mr. Wallace, a retiree known for his passion for analog cameras and vintage photographs. The small studio, its walls lined with sepia-toned portraits and antique equipment, exuded an air of nostalgia. Wallace greeted Daniel with a polite smile, but his expression shifted when he saw the photos. "These images are authentic," Wallace said after carefully examining the album through a magnifying glass. There's no sign of tampering. That man was genuinely present when these photos were taken. Wallace's objective confirmation raised more questions than it answered. Daniel asked if the man looked familiar, but Wallace shook his head slowly. I can't say I recognize him, but it's curious. He seems to always be in the same position, like he's watching something. That's unusual. Unsatisfied, Daniel spent the rest of the afternoon digging into the history of the photos, asking neighbors and old family friends if they recognized the man. Most people shrugged it off, barely noticing the stranger until Daniel pointed him out. A few suggested he might be a distant relative or someone who happened to be around during family events. But the older residents reacted differently, their discomfort palpable. One such conversation with Mr. Harris, a childhood friend of his father, sent a chill down Daniel's spine. Harris, a slow-talking man with distant eyes, recognized the man in the photos immediately. He's there again, Harris murmured, gripping the photo with trembling hands. Daniel pressed him for more details, but Harris seemed reluctant. That man. He's not like us, Harris finally said, his voice a mix of fear and resignation. He shows up where he shouldn't. Always at moments when something bad is about to happen. Your father knew that. Harris's words only deepened Daniel's unease. He tried to pry more from the older man, but Harris refused, saying he'd already said too much. Before Daniel left, Harris handed him a worn envelope with his father's name scrawled across it in faded ink. This is what he wanted you to know. But I'm warning you. Don't dig too deep. Back at the house, Daniel opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a handwritten letter from his father. The words, though fragmented, carried an urgency that was hard to ignore. The letter spoke of a man who was never meant to be there and warned Daniel to never seek him out or try to understand his presence. The final line of the letter made Daniel's heart race. He only appears when a choice must be made. Don't look at him for too long. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. The words from his father's letter echoed endlessly in his mind. Don't look at him for too long felt like both a warning and an unsolvable riddle. The album, now tucked away at the bottom of his suitcase, seemed to radiate a strange weight. Instead of diminishing his curiosity, it only fueled his determination to uncover the truth. At dawn, Daniel began combing through his own recent photos. He opened the gallery on his phone, scrolling quickly through images from parties, trips, and work gatherings. His heart froze when he found a photo taken weeks before his father's funeral. There was the same man, standing in the background of a crowd, staring directly into the camera. Daniel had no recollection of seeing him that day or noticing his presence until now. From that moment, everything felt different. Daniel started noticing the man in places he frequented. During his morning walks, he felt eyes on him, and when he turned around, there was always a figure at the edge of his vision. Driving through town, he glimpsed someone standing still, watching from a distance. The frequency of these sightings increased, and each appearance seemed closer, as if the man were slowly closing in on Daniel's life. Desperate for answers, Daniel decided to visit the town's historical archive, hoping to find records that might shed light on the mysterious figure. He spent hours leafing through yellowed newspapers but found no direct mentions of the man. However, he uncovered something even more unsettling, a pattern of tragedies in the town's history: fires, disappearances, and fatal accidents, all with photos that included an unidentified figure standing in the background. Daniel's mind spiraled with theories. Was the man a harbinger of disaster? An agent of some unknown force? Or something completely beyond comprehension? As he traced connections between the events in the photos and significant moments in his own life, a more terrifying realization began to take shape. The man always appeared at moments when Daniel had narrowly escaped death. One such moment was a photo of 10-year-old Daniel in a hospital bed after a severe car accident. In the background, almost imperceptible, was the same man. Daniel vividly remembered the accident, the chaos, the flashing lights of ambulances, and the doctors saying his survival was inexplicable. Now, looking at the photo, he couldn't dismiss the idea that the man's presence was no coincidence. As night fell, Daniel found himself overwhelmed by the mounting fear. Every sound, every shadow seemed to carry the weight of the man's silent presence. Exhausted, he decided to call his mother, hoping she might remember something that could help. Their conversation was brief and inconclusive. She reiterated that she had no memory of the man or any stranger being around during family events. But before hanging up, she mentioned something that made Daniel's heart skip. "Your father always had a habit of keeping important things at the back of the drawer in his study. Maybe there's something there." Back in his father's study, Daniel opened the drawer she had mentioned. After sifting through papers and objects that seemed trivial, he found a leather-bound journal hidden beneath a stack of files. The pages were filled with his father's handwriting, and what they contained made Daniel's blood run cold. The journal began innocuously enough, describing mundane events, family matters, and business dealings. But as Daniel read on, the tone grew more fragmented, the entries increasingly focused on the man. His father described how the figure began appearing after Daniel's accident, always on the periphery of important events, always watching. The final entries were the most chilling. His father recounted the day of Daniel's car accident in vivid detail, the crash, the paramedics, and the overwhelming sense of helplessness. Then he wrote about seeing the man at the scene, standing at the edge of the chaos, observing silently. Desperate to save his son, his father wrote that he ran to the man and begged for help. The account was disjointed, as if his father couldn't fully grasp or explain what happened next. "He didn't speak. He just looked at me, as if waiting for something in return. I don't know what I gave him, but I knew something was taken. When I returned to the car, Daniel was alive. It wasn't a coincidence." Daniel closed the journal, a chill running down his spine. The puzzle pieces were falling into place, but the picture they formed was more terrifying than he could have imagined. If his father's writings were true, then the man wasn't just an observer. He was connected to choices that determined life and death. As Daniel sat in the dimly lit study, he felt a shift in the air. The atmosphere grew heavy, and the shadows in the room seemed to deepen. He glanced toward the window and, for a fleeting moment, thought he saw a figure standing in the distance. His heart raced, but when he looked again, there was nothing there. The journal's final entry was a warning: "If you're reading this, it means he's returned. Don't try to fight him. He can't be defeated. Just remember, he only appears when a choice must be made. And the choice is never easy." The journal trembled in Daniel's hands, as if every word etched within it carried an unbearable weight. Sitting at his father's desk, illuminated only by the dim glow of an old lamp, he pressed on, driven by a need to understand. The further he read, the more fragmented his father's entries became, filled with paranoia and desperation. The man wasn't just a recurring presence in his father's life, he was an omen. His father wrote in detail about how the man's appearances became more frequent after Daniel's accident. He described seeing him in the background of birthday parties, family outings, and even mundane days. The figure was always there, lingering at the edges, watching but never interfering. One entry stood out among the rest. "He's waiting for something," his father had written, the handwriting shaky and uneven. "He doesn't act, he doesn't speak, but I can feel it, he's here for a purpose. He only comes when something must be decided. It's like he's waiting for the right moment, the moment when everything changes." Daniel's grip tightened on the journal as he turned the pages. He found accounts of his father trying to confront the man. One chilling entry described a night when his father saw the figure standing outside the house, staring up at the study window. His father ran outside, determined to confront him, but the man vanished before he could get close. After that, his father stopped trying, resigning himself to the belief that the man was beyond comprehension. The final pages of the journal recounted the day of Daniel's accident in vivid detail. His father described the fear and panic that consumed him as he watched the paramedics struggle to save his son. He wrote about the moment when he spotted the man at the edge of the crash site, standing still, as if observing the scene from another world. Desperate, his father approached the man. "I begged him to help," the entry read. "I don't know what I was asking for or why I thought he could do anything, but I begged. He didn't speak. He just looked at me, as if waiting for something I couldn't understand. And then, it was like he took something. I don't know what, but I felt it leave me. When I went back to the car, Daniel was alive. It wasn't a coincidence. It couldn't have been." Daniel closed the journal, his heart pounding. The pieces were coming together, but the picture they painted was something he could hardly comprehend. If what his father wrote was true, then the man wasn't just an observer. He was a catalyst, tied to decisions that carried unimaginable consequences. As Daniel tried to process what he had read, the room around him seemed to shift. The air grew colder, heavier, and the shadows in the corners of the study seemed to deepen. A faint creak echoed through the room, and Daniel froze. For a moment, he thought he saw movement outside the window. With trembling hands, he placed the journal back in the drawer. He felt the weight of his father's warning press down on him. "He only appears when a choice must be made," the words echoed in his mind. Whatever choice the man was waiting for, Daniel knew it would come for him soon. The days that followed were marked by an unshakable tension. Daniel avoided looking at the album, fearing the man would appear again. Every step he took seemed haunted by an unseen presence, and the silence of the old family house only amplified his growing paranoia. Yet, he knew he couldn't ignore the man's existence forever. The mystery demanded answers. On a cold Saturday morning, Daniel decided to take action. He revisited his father's journal, the album, and the cryptic letter, searching for any clues that might help him make sense of what was happening. One phrase from the journal seemed to echo louder than the rest: "He only appears when something must be decided." That thought consumed him as he drove to the park mentioned in his father's writings, the place where his father claimed to have last seen the man. The park was eerily empty, the air heavy with an unplaceable tension. The bare trees swayed slightly in the breeze, their branches creaking like whispers in the stillness. And then Daniel saw him. The man stood near a weathered bench, dressed in the same dark suit and hat he had worn in every photograph. He looked just as solid and real as any passerby, yet something about him defied logic. Daniel's chest tightened, his instinct screaming at him to leave, but his legs moved on their own. "Who are you?" Daniel called out, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. The man didn't answer right away. His deep, unreadable eyes locked onto Daniel, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, steady, and impossibly heavy with meaning. "You know who I am." "No, I don't," Daniel shot back, his frustration mounting. "Why are you in the photos? Why were you there when my father—" He stopped, his voice faltering. "Why are you here now?" The man tilted his head slightly, as though considering Daniel's questions. "I am where I need to be," he said, his words cryptic yet deliberate. "You see me because a decision must be made. A choice that will change everything." Daniel clenched his fists. "What choice? What are you talking about?" The man's gaze didn't waver. "Your life was saved. But nothing comes without a price. It is time for that price to be paid. The weight of those words hit Daniel like a blow. What do you mean, a price? My father, he's the one who, he trailed off, realizing the implications of what the man was saying. The man took a step closer, his presence suddenly overwhelming. You were spared, Daniel. Now, another must pay. The question is, what are you willing to sacrifice? The air around them seemed to grow heavier, pressing down on Daniel's chest. He wanted to argue, to fight back, but he knew it would be useless. The man wasn't offering him a way out, he was presenting him with an ultimatum. Your life, the man continued, his voice steady, or hers. Daniel's breath caught. My mother, he whispered, horrified. The man didn't answer, but the silence was enough. Daniel felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He thought of his mother, the one constant in his life, the person who had always stood by him. The idea of letting her pay for a choice she had no part in was unthinkable. You can't do this, Daniel said, his voice breaking. You can't ask me to make this decision. The man's expression didn't change. The decision has already been made, Daniel. It is not about fairness, it is about balance. The clock in the distance chimed, each sound like a countdown to the inevitable. Daniel felt tears well up, but he refused to let them fall. He thought of his father's warnings, the journal, the photos, and the unspoken truth behind every word. He knew what he had to do. I'll do it, Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper. I'll take her place. The man studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he gave a single nod. Then it is decided. Before Daniel could say another word, the world around him seemed to dissolve. The park, the trees, even the air itself faded away into nothingness. All that remained was the man, standing still as Daniel's vision blurred and his consciousness slipped into darkness. Daniel woke up in a place that defied all sense of reality. The air around him was thick with an unnatural stillness, and a heavy fog obscured everything beyond a few feet. The ground beneath his feet felt solid yet invisible, as though he was suspended in a void. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint, distant sound of something he couldn't identify. He couldn't remember how he had arrived there, but he knew this was no dream. He scanned his surroundings and saw the man standing at a distance. His figure loomed larger now, his presence more imposing, as if the very fabric of the space revolved around him. Daniel's fear battled with a strange sense of inevitability. He began to walk toward the man, every step heavier than the last. You've made your choice, the man said, his voice calm and unyielding. But you must understand what it truly means. Daniel stopped, his breathing shallow. What do you mean? I accepted. I chose. My mother is safe, isn't she? The man tilted his head slightly, a gesture that seemed to carry both understanding and indifference. Your choice was clear. But sacrifices are never simple. You didn't just offer your life, Daniel. You offered your existence. The words sent a chill through Daniel. What does that mean? The man stepped closer, and the void seemed to constrict around them. It means you will not be remembered. You will have no legacy, no impact. For the world, you will become like me. Someone who was never truly there. Daniel's chest tightened as the realization sank in. He thought of the photos, the moments where the man had appeared, unnoticed and unacknowledged. That's what he was, a shadow, a witness to life's most pivotal decisions, destined to fade into obscurity. Is that what you are? Daniel asked, his voice trembling. Were you like me? The man didn't answer directly. Instead, he looked into the void surrounding them, his gaze distant. All of us made choices. And all of us paid the price. Now, it is your turn. Before Daniel could respond, the man raised a hand, and the fog around them began to shift. It swirled and thickened, enveloping everything in a suffocating darkness. Daniel felt his body begin to dissolve, not in pain, but in an overwhelming sense of erasure. His memories, his identity, everything that defined him, began to slip away. He tried to hold on, but it was like grasping at smoke. The last thing Daniel saw was the man's face, no longer indifferent but carrying a faint trace of sorrow. It was a look that conveyed understanding, as if the man knew exactly what Daniel was sacrificing. Then, the void swallowed him entirely, and he was gone. In his mother's house, life moved forward as if nothing had happened. The memory of Daniel became a faint echo, a presence no one could quite place. His mother sat alone in the living room, flipping through the photo album she had kept on the table for weeks. Something felt different, though she couldn't say what. When she reached a familiar photo, a childhood picture of Daniel at a park, her breath caught. There were two figures in the background now. One was the man she didn't recognize, the one she'd seen before. The other looked so much like her son. She stared at the photo for a long time, an unshakable sense of unease creeping over her. Yet, when she tried to recall what had changed, the details slipped away like a forgotten dream. Daniel opened his eyes to find himself in a place that felt both endless and suffocatingly small. The air was heavy, the atmosphere saturated with a sense of finality. Around him, there was only an expanse of mist, swirling slowly as though alive. His body felt weightless and yet burdened by an unseen force. Ahead, the man stood motionless, his figure dominating the void. His presence seemed larger now, more commanding, as though he had grown into something beyond human comprehension. Daniel felt a pull, an inevitability that compelled him forward. With each step he took, the fog seemed to part, clearing the path toward his fate. "You've completed your part," the man said, his voice resonating through the emptiness. "But there is one more thing you must understand." Daniel stopped in his tracks, his chest tightening. "I made the choice," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "My mother is safe. That's all that matters." The man's eyes, dark and endless, locked onto Daniel. There was no malice in them, but neither was there comfort. "Your choice has saved her," he said, his tone steady and deliberate. "But every choice carries consequences beyond what is seen. You did not simply give your life, Daniel. You gave your place in the world." Daniel's breath caught. "What does that mean?" The man stepped closer, his presence magnified. "You will no longer exist as you were. You will become a shadow, a figure that is there but never acknowledged. For all who knew you, you will be a fleeting memory, a fragment that fades with time. You will be like me, a witness to the moments that shape others, but never truly a part of them." Daniel felt the weight of the man's words press down on him. "You're saying I'll be forgotten? Erased?" The man gave a slight nod. "Not forgotten. You will remain in the background, a part of the world in ways no one will ever understand. That is the price for what you've done." Daniel's mind raced, grasping at the fragments of what remained of his existence. "You were like me once," he said, his voice trembling. "You made a choice too, didn't you?" The man's expression shifted, a flicker of humanity breaking through his stoic demeanor. "Yes," he admitted softly. "We all made choices. And now you join us." The fog around them began to move, swirling faster, enveloping Daniel in its cold embrace. He felt himself slipping away, his thoughts unraveling, his identity dissolving. The memories of his life, his childhood, his family, his mother, began to fade, replaced by a void he couldn't escape. Before he disappeared completely, he looked at the man one last time. For a moment, he thought he saw something in the man's eyes, a glimmer of regret, or perhaps understanding. Then, everything went dark. In the small town where Daniel had lived, life continued without interruption. For those who had known him, he was a faint memory, a presence they couldn't quite place. His mother, sitting alone in the living room, flipped through the photo album she had kept close since his departure. When she reached a familiar picture, one of Daniel as a child in the park, she froze. There were now two figures in the background. One was the man she had never recognized, the same shadow that lingered in so many of the photos. The other was her son. She stared at the image, an unexplainable sadness welling up inside her. She didn't understand what had changed, but she felt the weight of something lost, something she could no longer name. Life in the small town carried on as if nothing extraordinary had happened. The passing of Daniel's father had been absorbed into the rhythm of daily life, and Daniel's absence was quietly rationalized as an unspoken departure. For those who knew him, he was little more than a fleeting thought, a name that occasionally surfaced without context or connection. But something changed that morning. At his mother's house, the photo album that had rested on the living room table seemed to beckon her attention once more. She opened it, flipping through the pages with a sense of unease. The pictures felt different. Subtly altered in ways she couldn't immediately pinpoint. Her eyes landed on a photo she had seen countless times, a picture of Daniel as a boy, laughing in the park. But now, there were two figures in the background. One was the familiar man, the shadow she had never been able to explain. The other was someone new, someone eerily familiar. Her breath caught as she realized it was Daniel. She stared at the photo, her heart heavy with an inexplicable sorrow. Though she couldn't place why, she felt as though something precious had slipped away from her grasp, something she would never fully understand. The sensation lingered, a faint ache that would never quite leave. Elsewhere in town, others began to notice a similar presence. At weddings, parades, and even school events, photos revealed the same figure lurking in the background. Sometimes there were two. Conversations arose, quiet murmurs about the strange man, or men, who seemed to appear without reason. Yet, for all the curiosity, no one could recall ever seeing them in person. In a small house on the edge of town, Erin, a young photographer, developed pictures for an art project she'd been working on. Her work focused on forgotten places, abandoned buildings, quiet forests, neglected streets. But as she hung her latest batch of photos to dry, one image made her freeze. There, in the corner of an old, crumbling room, stood two figures. One was dressed in the familiar dark suit and hat, his face calm and unreadable. The other looked younger, his expression filled with something that seemed almost like regret. Erin's hands trembled as she stared at the photo. She didn't remember seeing anyone in the room when she took the picture. Determined to make sense of it, Erin began asking questions around town. She showed the photo to people, but most averted their eyes or shrugged it off as an oddity. An elderly woman at the library, however, reacted differently. Her face paled when she saw the figures. "They only appear when something important is about to happen," she said in a hushed tone. "They don't belong to our world. They never have." Erin's curiosity grew into obsession. She spent days researching old photographs in the town's archives. The pattern was undeniable. These figures had appeared in moments tied to tragedy and choice, always on the outskirts, always watching. One evening, as Erin reviewed her findings in her dimly lit apartment, she heard a faint creak from the other room. She turned toward the sound, her pulse quickening. On the table where she had left her camera sat an album she didn't recognize. Its cover was worn, its edges frayed, as though it had passed through countless hands. She opened it, her breath catching in her throat. The photos inside weren't of places she recognized, but each one contained the two figures. As she flipped through, the images became more personal, more specific. The final photo stopped her cold. It was a picture of her, taken from across the room, with the two figures standing behind her. The room seemed to grow colder, and Erin's body froze as a shadow fell over her. Turning slowly, she saw one of the figures standing in the doorway. His expression wasn't threatening, but it carried a weight that pressed down on her chest. "You have a choice to make," he said, his voice deep and steady. Before Erin could respond, the room darkened, the edges of her vision dissolving into shadow. The last thing she saw was the man's face, calm and unyielding, as the void swallowed her. The album remained on the table, waiting for someone else to find it. The photos inside shifted and changed, capturing events yet to come. The cycle continued, and the figures persisted, silent witnesses to the decisions that shaped lives and destinies.